We will be starting the seminar today, and fertility is always the pretty hot topic for the audience, and we are really pleased to introduce Janelle Wanzek to give us this comprehensive talk. And this is my pleasure to introduce Janelle for this talk. And without further ado, please take away.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. I'm happy to be here today to get to chat with you all. I want it to be kind of interactive too, so if anyone feels comfortable to turn on their cameras or ask a question at any time, feel free. We can also do the chat box, but maybe I can have some help just letting me know if there is any messages in the chat. But thanks for everyone for showing up today. This talk is all going to be about embracing your cycles and understanding our fertility, stuff that we probably weren't taught when we were growing up, and then we're trying to figure it out on our own as an adults. And there's a lot of ambiguity, especially like going into healthcare providers. Sometimes it can be really challenging to ask certain questions. So I'm hoping with today's presentation that you can feel empowered to understand your cycles, your fertility, and feel good going in when you're advocating for yourself and trying to understand your own fertility health a little bit better. So I'm just gonna a couple introductions. So today we're going to be talking about like the anatomy, seasons/phases of our menstrual cycle, biomarkers to help understand when we're ovulating, and then like key questions to ask your care provider as well. First, I just want to start out by taking a second to get to know each other, but first I want to help everyone feel grounded and present in the space so that we can really absorb the information the best we can. So if everyone feels comfortable to just take a moment to like lower your gaze or close your eyes and taking a deep breath into your body. Noticing your sit bones on the chair and your feet on the floor. Taking another deep breath in, bringing good oxygen to your body. Noticing how you're showing up today. If you're feeling stressed or rushed, or if you're feeling calm because it's a Saturday, just relaxed and enjoying your day. Tuning into your body and noticing what your body needs in this moment. If you need to sit a little bit more comfortably in your chair, or a sip of water, just honoring that. Taking another deep breath into your belly and letting it go. And whenever you're ready, you can bring your eyes back to the screen. And hopefully that helps kind of just ground everybody in for today as we absorb some good information. I like to have some practices with that just because I feel like with fertility care, there's such a big mind-body connection with this, and the journey through fertility can teach you a lot about how to connect with your body, especially with pregnancy and pregnancy loss. There's a lot to kind of absorb in like the more like grounding in with your body and like understanding like what it means to bring life in through the body. So yeah, I can always talk more about the mindfulness practices that I try to incorporate, stress reduction and stuff as well in fertility care. But yeah, if everybody wants to say their name and why you joined today, we can. Or I can start with introducing myself and then we can go around with that too. So. My name is Janelle. I'm a physician assistant. I work with the University of Utah Restorative Reproductive Clinic here in Salt Lake City. I'm also studying to be a midwife and work as a birth assistant at Wasatch Midwifery here in Salt Lake City. I've studied biology and anthropology, got my master's in physician assistant in Las Vegas, Nevada. And then I've done multiple trainings on fertility awareness methods just to help better understand the woman's cycle and how to educate women on it and to help with fertility as well. So right now, my primary focus in my work is helping people have a better relationship with their cycles, whether it's like irregular bleeding patterns or PCOS, or infertility or multiple miscarriages, to understand what's actually going on and what's the root cause behind some of the issues with the cycle. So that's kind of my focus now. So I want to kind of just start out with like basic anatomy around the cycle. But then I do want to kind of get into some of those deeper questions about like the labs and like what options you have with like fertility and how to know if you're actually fertile. I feel like in my years as working as a PA in women's health, I had a lot of women coming in just asking like, how do I know if I'm fertile? Like, what can I know? Or how can I know if I'm able to have a baby? They're like, I'm not really wanting to have one right away, but like I want to know if I will have good chances in like the coming years. So that's a very like common question. And I feel like a lot of times doctors will be like, well, as long as you're having periods, you know, you're good. But really, just having a period doesn't tell us if we're actually ovulating. Having a regular period most of the times, that would be a good sign of fertility, but sometimes you could have lighter periods or irregular bleeding patterns that by textbook would be like, oh, I'm having a period every month, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're having an ovulation event every month. So the ovulation is what's really showing if we're fertile or not. So I'm going to just kind of walk through the basic like anatomy cycle for women. So that way we can understand a little bit better when I go into the deeper parts of like the certain hormones and the testing with all of that and how to track your ovulation. So over here we have like the basic body parts with the uterus, the ovaries, the fallopian tube, the cervix, and the vagina. And you can kind of see how it lies in between the bladder and the rectum here. This whole chart on this side, though, is where we're going to get into like the nitty-gritty details of all of the hormones. So there's the key factors at play, the brain, the ovaries, and then the uterus and cervix. So we'll keep each of those in mind as we're going through this. So all of our hormonal, our reproductive hormonal aspect starts in the brain. So the first hormone that comes down to the ovaries is your follicle stimulating hormone. This is the hormone that tells your ovaries to start to produce eggs. As that starts in the beginning of your early cycle to rise, that tells the follicle to start growing, and the follicle helps produce estrogen. And so the estrogen starts to rise, and that sends a feedback to grow that follicle larger. Estrogen also impacts the endometrial lining to proliferate. So the endometrial lining will start to thicken with estrogen influence. So that's all in the early part of the cycle called the follicular phase of your cycle. Once your FSH and your estrogen get to a certain level, it sends a feedback loop to the brain that, hey, we have a mature follicle and it's ready to get ovulated. And then the brain sends down what's called the luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone is what you would see on like an ovulation p-test that you could do at home, like those ovulation kits, is checking for LH in your urine. The LH is like the signal from the brain to like a switch to like release the egg there. So usually you just get one big peak in that at the time of ovulation. Once you get that LH peak, usually the egg is released within the next day or two after that LH peak. What's left over around the follicle after the egg is released collapses down and becomes the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts to produce progesterone. The progesterone helps to keep the endometrial lining stabilized, encourages more blood vessels to grow in that endometrial lining. Because if you did conceive on this cycle, that little egg would have floated down the fallopian tube, met sperm here in the fallopian tube, and kept floating until implanted onto that endometrial lining. So that whole time, the progesterone is starting to grow all of these arteries and extra nutrients, so that when the embryo implants, that's ready to form the placenta and give all the nutrients to that follicle or to that embryo. But if there isn't implantation and there isn't a follicle that was fertilized, the corpus luteum will dissolve away after about 12 to 16 days. And when that progesterone stops getting produced and drops, that's what triggers the menstrual cycle to start. So once that drops, then your body's like, okay, we're just going to shed all of that lining. So that's kind of the basics of the hormonal pattern there. But another part of the anatomy that gets affected by the estrogen and the progesterone is not only the endometrial lining, but also the cervix. So we're going to see a little bit more of that here in the next couple slides. So this is kind of just reiterating a little bit with how it starts in the brain, and then how that can affect our ovulation pattern. So that's where I like to incorporate some of the mindfulness practices, because a lot of times stress, if we're sick, if we have like crazy work schedules, if we're imbalanced with our diet, or not being connected with our body, that can impair the signals that are being sent from our brain to our reproductive organs and can affect ovulation. So it's good to keep that in mind, that it's a whole body thing. It's not just the ovaries and the uterus by themselves. This is just a close-up picture of the follicles getting developed on the ovary. This doesn't all happen at once, but in the picture, it's all happening at once on here. And another representation here. But I wanted to get to this slide. So this one shows what's happening at the cervix. So when estrogen is present in the early part of our cycle and at ovulation, we'll have clear, stretchy, and slippery cervical mucus. So the cervix has these little crypts that will produce with certain estrogen or progesterone different types of mucus. So you can get the fertile type of mucus at ovulation, and you can see under the microscope, this is like a cartoon version of it, but you can see under an actual microscope that there's like channels, and they've seen that like that type of cervical mucus helps the sperm get to the egg, it helps the sperm live for 5 to 6 days. It provides a really like good environment for the sperm. So that's how the fertile days work. After you've ovulated, the progesterone that's present, it causes the cervical crypts to produce what's called the like G-type mucus. It's more like a thick, like creamy, or some women just don't even notice any mucus, and it will be like kind of like a plug in the uterus or in the cervix so that nothing can get into the uterus. So if there was like other bacteria or other sperm that would be able to get in, that's like a protective mechanism, because if you were to conceive, we wouldn't want anything disrupting that embryo that's just starting to implant. So it's kind of cool with that, how the cervix is acting as this gate, or like protector of the womb. So this is really cool representation with it. These are pulled from the Beautiful Cervix website. So we can see just like what it would look like on a pap smear view of the cervix. So we have the menstrual phase, and then the follicular phase. We're starting to see a little bit of that cervical mucus. At ovulation, the cervix is open and there's a bunch of fertile type of mucus. And then after, when progesterone's dominant, there's more of that creamy and the cervix is closed again. Any questions so far, or should I keep going? Okay, all right. Okay, so then we can kind of break it down into the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. We have the bleeding, then we have some dry time, and then the fertile time when the cervical mucus picks up, and then some dry time again. So these are otherwise known as like the menstrual part of the cycle, follicular, ovulation, and then your luteal phase. I like to correlate them to our inner seasons. So I made this whole representation, which kind of correlates with the spring being your follicular phase, when all the follicles are starting to grow. So it's like a budding flower. Your energy is starting to rise. Things are kind of waking up in the springtime. And then I like to correlate ovulation to the summertime, when the flowers are in full bloom, your follicles at the largest. You're feeling your most energy. Your cervix is like open and secreting that fertile cervical mucus. So everything's just like happy and ready. And then the fall, I like to correlate to the luteal phase, because it's kind of this like waiting time and nurturing time. Like in the fall, we like to be like cozy and eat soup and kind of go inward a little bit more and take care of our space before the winter comes. So it's just kind of the similar like mirror with that with the body, as we're waiting and seeing if there is going to be an implantation or a fertilized egg. And then the menstrual phase, I like to correlate to winter. This is because everything kind of drops with the hormones. Usually you're feeling a little bit more like, I want to rest, not wanting to go out and do a lot and just take care of yourself during that time, be more meditative. Another way you could correlate it is with the moon phases as well. So it'd be like the waxing moon, the full moon, the waning, and the new moon. I just love to see how it's like a perfect mirror with our cycles, with nature, with the moon and the seasons. So it helps me to just connect every month as I'm tracking my cycle a little bit more. And we can chat about that side of it too, if that will be helpful to you guys. But I want to jump into kind of like how to actually know when you're ovulating. So this is where it gets a little sciencey. We talked a little bit about the cervical mucus, but they have done a bunch of research in this where we can actually know for certain if we're ovulating close to about like 97, 98% effectiveness with just cervical mucus alone. If you're being diligent about checking every time you go to the bathroom and recording the most fertile type of mucus every day. I think I had mentioned that the clear, stretchy more than 1 inch and the slippery feeling when you wipe, those are the three biomarkers that you're going to be looking for with it there. And it doesn't have to be all three of them. Any type of like clear mucus would be considered fertile mucus, or any type of slippery, even though there might not be anything when you look on the toilet paper, if it felt slippery, that would be a fertile day as well. The last day that you notice any fertile type of mucus, if it's clear, stretchy, or slippery feeling, that would be your peak day. And they've shown with ultrasound studies that on your peak day of cervical mucus, ovulation is typically happening either plus or minus 2 days of that peak day. So if you're trying to conceive, a good time to have intercourse would be like any day there's the fertile cervical mucus. So every other day during that time, and then a few days after you see the last day of the cervical mucus. If you're trying to avoid pregnancy, just any day you see cervical mucus would be a day to avoid or use other protection. And then for a count of 3 days after that last day of cervical mucus, just because there was that plus or minus 2 days. So they say 3 days to be safe. A couple other biomarkers that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. The LH strips we talked about a little bit, how that signal from the brain to the ovary to release the egg is that luteinizing hormone. Typically, when you see a positive, ovulation is going to happen in the next 1 to 2 days after. So you can check that one at home pretty easily. There's like an app called Premom where you can take pictures of all of the LH strips you've checked at home, and that can be useful to kind of compare. They have another couple monitors called Mira, and Anido is another one too, where you can check more than just your LH. It also checks your estrogen and your progesterone and your FSH. So those can be helpful if you want to monitor just hormonal wise at home. Usually these are better when you're trying to conceive. It doesn't help you to know if you've actually ovulated. That's where basal body temperature can come in. This one helps confirm that you ovulated. It doesn't predict if you're in your fertile window. So the cervical mucus and the LH are predicting that ovulation is going to be happening. The basal body temperature is the only one that confirms that it happened. Because with basal body temperature, that's checking your resting metabolic temperature. So every morning when you wake up, you want to check in your like resting temperature. So right after you wake up is when your body temperature is going to be at the lowest. So you need to have at least 4 hours of sleep, and then checking it first thing before you get up out of bed. After you've ovulated and your body starts to produce the progesterone, your body temperature will rise by 0.5 degrees Celsius. I believe that converts over to like 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit, or slightly with that. And you should be looking for 3 temps that are higher than the previous 6, and then that would confirm that you've have good progesterone production and that you've ovulated. So it doesn't work like in the movies. I think there's like one movie I've seen where the woman's like checking her temperature and then she like runs to her partner and she's like, I'm ovulating. And I was like, oh no, that's wrong. It doesn't help to predict it. It would be like after you've ovulated that you would see that temperature shift. So it helps if you have a way to track all of this. The app that I use and that from all of my research of all the different charting methods and apps out there, I feel like this one is the best, just because it lets you track so many different stuff with the biomarkers and symptoms. It's called the Neofertility app or Chart Neo. Um, it has like the options to put in your cervical mucus, your temperature, any like urinary tests that you checked, any symptoms if you had like breast tenderness or cramping. You can also put in if you wanted to track diet or exercise and stuff like that. So I think this one's really useful. Um, I'll show you a little bit more how it like lets you enter in your cervical mucus here. So it gives you kind of the step-by-step wise. You can even put in medications as well too. So if anyone has questions on different charting apps or other stuff too, I'd be happy to answer that as well. I've tried out a bunch of them. But that's the one I usually recommend to my patients. And I do think it's important too when you're working with a fertility care provider to have some form of like charting method that you're already using when you go in there. So then you can show them like, hey, this is where I'm at with like my bleeding patterns, my ovulation pattern. That can help them clue them into like what might be imbalanced with your cycle. If we're having like lower progesterone production, you might have a shorter luteal phase. If you're having a lot of spotting, that could be a clue into like low progesterone or endometriosis or endometritis. So there's a bunch of clues that we can get from your chart alone with just having a good record of your bleeding pattern and your cervical mucus. And then if you are checking anything with hormones or your temperature as well. But this slide, I know we're probably going to talk a lot about it, kind of like what basic labs that your healthcare provider should be ordering to assess your fertility. Um, so usually if you are having like a good ovulation pattern with your cervical mucus and having regular cycles, not a lot of symptoms of like PMS or irregular bleeding, like heavy bleeding and stuff, I'd say like 9 times out of 10, you're probably having a good ovulation pattern and that you're fertile. But these labs are going to clue us in a little bit more. Because like even for myself personally, like I've had pretty regular cycles. I was charting my cervical mucus and was like, okay, I must be like pretty fertile. And then I went and got labs done because I had a lot of PMS symptoms. And I was like, I want to know what's actually going on. And it turns out like I was had a little bit of increased prolactin and some other labs that were a little bit off, like my vitamin D was super low. But I've been working to like increase my progesterone in my luteal phase because I wasn't having a good egg quality, and that was leading to a lot of my PMS symptoms. So I was shocked to find that like I was having cycles where I wasn't even ovulating well. But that's where like listening to your body's clues with like your PMS symptoms, your mood overall, and then the cervical mucus and all that can help. But these are like the basic list of labs that I order for every patient that comes in. Usually I'm ordering the early cycle lab, so I have it broken down in the early cycle here. All of these ones at the beginning of the cycle, usually cycle day 2 through 5. And that's because that's when hormones are at the lowest. So like if we went back to that chart at the beginning, we can see how there's a lot of fluctuations of our hormones throughout the cycle. And that's not just for those 4 main ones that I mentioned, but a lot of other ones too, like your testosterone and your prolactin. Those can vary throughout the cycle as well too. Um, if anyone has specific questions on any of these labs, feel free to jump in. I wanted to touch a little bit on the AMH because I know someone brought that up at the beginning. The AMH is anti-Müllerian hormone. That one, typically the providers will draw that one to see like what egg reserve we have left. So it's a loose marker on how many eggs you have left. It's not like typically if you have like an AMH of 3 that you're like, oh, I have like 5 years left or something like that. It's just showing you that you do have a good egg quality in production. Typically, I tell patients if it's a below a 1, that's where we're more on the worrisome side. It's not like game over until it's like at like 0 and that your FSH is also elevated. We've had a lot of patients that come in with a low AMH, but their FSH is still in a good spot. So if we remember, the FSH is the signal to the from the brain to the ovaries to make follicles. If your FSH is in a good spot, that means that your ovaries are still responding to your brain's signal and making follicles. But if your FSH is really elevated, that means that your brain is yelling at the ovary to make more follicles. And that's how you can tell if someone's in menopause or perimenopausal if they have an increased FSH and a low AMH. Because that would be saying, oh, there's no more follicles, no more eggs that are developing. And the brain's like, come on. And the ovary's like, I don't have any more. But just a low AMH by itself doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to ovulate anymore. It just might mean that we need to work with your body to like adjust hormones a little bit more. Typically, it's really low estrogen, so we need to usually do like an estrogen supplementation to help kind of increase that AMH a little bit and get some follicles to respond. But yeah, I think it's usually if you're under an AMH of like 0.5, any like IVF or egg freezing or egg retrieval, they're usually going to be like a little bit more hesitant to try to stimulate because they might not retrieve as many embryo or as many follicles to make into embryos. So that's where the AMH can come into an important play if it's lower and you're trying to freeze eggs or go through an IVF process, it might be a little bit harder to retrieve a follicle for that. If your AMH is elevated, that can be a sign of polycystic ovarian syndrome because you have like a bunch of little follicles. So the AMH measures higher with polycystic ovarian syndrome. And as we work to treat that and help your cycles get into more regular ovulation pattern, that AMH can lower down. So it's kind of a variation one. I could talk a lot about all these labs. So if anyone has specific questions on the labs, feel free to put it in the chat or we can ask at the end and come back to it too. I also wanted to touch in on, because I didn't have this on this list, but specifically with PCOS, I see a lot of patients that have insulin resistance. But then there's also the other side of it is like you could have insulin resistance or prediabetes that could be causing a polycystic ovarian pattern. So I like to do what's called a glucose tolerance test, where you'd go into the lab fasting and they'd have you drink a glucose drink. And then afterwards, they would check your insulin and your glucose again. And this can clue us in to see if you have insulin resistance before it's even turned into prediabetes. Our ovarian tissue and also a men's testicle tissue is really sensitive to elevated glucose levels. And if there's increased insulin or insulin resistance, that can impair egg production and sperm production. So that's a really common thing that I treat with patients, usually with either supplements of berberine or inositol, or starting on a low amount of metformin, which is a diabetes medication. And then you can see that help the sperm production and the egg quality. So that's an important one to ask any healthcare provider you're going into, not just checking all of these like hormonal labs, but also looking for insulin resistance. I'm usually also ordering just like the basic stuff with like your lipids, cholesterol levels, and then like your liver and kidney function and all of that too. And then post-peak labs are important. I usually do a series of those to look at how your progesterone production is and like a curve with it. And I'm also ordering an estradiol with that too, or the estrogen, to see how your progesterone and estrogen are balanced. If you have estrogen dominance, that can be a little bit worrisome for like implantation and having a good endometrial that's present there for that embryo to implant in. And a low progesterone can lead to earlier miscarriage as well. So it's important to see where those are at. Other tests that I might order would be like an HSG or a hydrosplanchogram. It's a longer word, but what that one is to look to see if the fallopian tubes are open and if there's any irregularities on the endometrial lining. Or we could just do a basic ultrasound to look at the anatomy overall. I do a lot in my clinic is a follicular ultrasound study where we do timed ultrasounds throughout your cycle to see how your follicles are developing and collapsing. Other ones that you might be curious to ask your provider about is a endometrial biopsy if you were looking for anything with endometritis or endometriosis. That might come in handy with that, or if you have a lot of irregular bleeding patterns. And then if you've had multiple miscarriages, doing like coagulation tests, or testing for the MTHFR mutation that can lead to earlier miscarriages too. Um, I'll flip to the next page. I think my next one was just like wanting to ask you guys what specific questions that you think would be important to ask the fertility care provider. Kind of started us out with like, how do you check hormones throughout my cycle? Are you timing my like lab draws throughout my cycle? How do you work up for endometriosis or manage endometriosis? And you could switch that out with like PCOS and like, or PMS or managing certain stuff with that. And then if they test for insulin resistance. Um, and then, yeah, I think we're kind of at the end here, but I kind of wanted to open it up now to see what your guys' questions are and what would be beneficial to focus on a little bit more for you guys. Sorry if I talked really quickly. I feel like I'm like, there's so much information to give. I want to put it all out there. So,
Yes. Oh, I do have a question about the follicular ultrasound study. So I
yeah,
think doing the ultrasound for whole the follicular phase. So does that mean that you need to be in the clinic every day for that follicular
no,
cycle? Yeah, how that works.
yeah, good question. Usually I save to most patients, it's going to be about 3 ultrasounds in the cycle, kind of depending on when you're ovulating. So we usually aim to do one ultrasound around like, and I look typically at their previous charts and see when their ovulation day has been. So usually I am aiming for like, let's say they ovulate typically on cycle day 15. So then I would say we'll come in on like cycle day 10 or 11, do the first ultrasound and see how large the follicles are. And then have you come back again on the day of ovulation or as close to ovulation day as we can. And then again, 3 days after the ovulation. So with that, we're gathering how thick is your endometrial lining, how large is that follicle growing. Usually a mature follicle, we want to see around like 20 to 25 millimeters. So that'd be like 2 centimeters is like the optimal size for a follicle. And then after ovulation, you want to see it collapse into that corpus luteum, and it would collapse usually by like 6 millimeters. So it would kind of go down to like maybe like 14 millimeters in its size.
Okay.
And a good endometrial thickness is anywhere from like 6 to 10 millimeters. There's not an exact science with that one, but they've seen conceptions with a bunch of different sizes with it. But it's kind of cool too, because you can also see on the ultrasound the differences in appearance of the endometrial lining. So like if we go back to the very beginning slide, how I was mentioning how as it's thickening up with the estrogen, we can actually see what that looks like on the ultrasound. And then once it gets the progesterone influence, it like changes appearance on the ultrasound. So I can tell when you've ovulated kind of based off of just that alone too. And you can look at the cervix to see if it's open or closed. So
Mm.
there's a lot of information we can gather from a follicular ultrasound study. It's kind of cool. I like doing them.
Yeah, but I also wonder because like you mentioned, if we, for example, if one person they also do like track this like ovulation test and they have the regular ovulation and if they also do the HSG like you just mentioned earlier, like the follicle tube is not closed, then what kind of the timing would you like order that a follicular ultrasound study
Yeah.
that to check like
Yeah.
yeah like to be more so specific for that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, usually I start out with getting the labs first to see if there's any imbalances like hormonal wise that we can work on first.
Mm,
And then I'm like having a woman like chart for a few cycles. Kind of depends on like how quickly she's wanted to conceive. If she's like, I wish I was pregnant like yesterday, and like then I'd probably say after like 2 cycles of like looking at her labs, then I would be like, well, let's look at the ultrasound to see where we're at too. And I'm also always ordering a semen analysis for their partner
mm,
because we don't want to ignore that half of it because that's like an important half for sure.
mm.
I don't want to be doing all of the ultrasound tests and being like, well, your cycles look perfect, but ignoring the fact that like maybe there's a low sperm count or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, usually after like a couple cycles, after I've gathered like the lab data, and seeing that and looked at like her charting with her biomarkers on that, um,
Mm,
Sometimes though, like when you've had an optimized cycle, when we see all the hormones are in a good spot and that charting's looking good too, it usually takes about like on average 4 to 8 months of trying during those times to see a conception. So some time with that there. But sometimes it is that we see that the follicle's not getting to a mature size, and that's where medications like Clomid and Letrozole can be really useful. If we see that the follicle's at the mature size, but it doesn't collapse properly, that's where like a trigger shot can be useful as well to help emphasize that LH message from the brain to release that egg from there. Does that answer questions?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I have a question. So, if we're not at the stage where like, oh, okay, we're going to like a care provider and doing all these lab tests, what are some signs that we should look for? Like other than, okay, you're having regular cycles, like you're not like having irregular bleeding. Like, what are some other signs? Like, can you talk more about like PMS or like possible PCOS symptoms and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, anytime someone comes into my clinic, I'm always asking about like pain with their periods, because that can be really important if you're having like pain where you're needing to take like medication every cycle for like more than a day or two. That would be important to go to a healthcare provider to see what workup they can do for that. Or just starting up other supplements or medications to help with that a little bit better. So pain with your cycle for sure. Bleeding more than 2 days, like spotting on either side of it, or like a longer phase of bleeding would be an important one to get worked up. If you're having spotting mid-cycle, that could be a sign of like polyps or having estrogen dominance, and stuff like that. So it's like their endometrial lining is growing and not able to maintain itself. That could be that you have too much estrogen, or if there's like a polyp or something inside the uterus, that could lead to spotting mid-cycle. PMS symptoms with like mood changes, like irritability, like easily crying, if you have breast tenderness, or bloating, all of those ones can be signs of low progesterone or estrogen dominance. Um, I know a lot of times as women, we're like told like, okay, that's just part of like life, like you gotta live with your cycle. And there is some truth to that because like we do have like these cyclical bodies where we are in different states in each of them because we have these hormonal shifts, and we have like when estrogen's dominant, we're gonna feel more energized and more social, more ready to like plan, or like we don't need as much sleep during our follicular and ovulation phases compared to like when progesterone's dominant, when we feel more like restful and wanting to be home and needing more sleep during that time. So there is some truth to like listening to our bodies in that. But if we're noticing like I'm not feeling myself with like having like so much mood disruption or like feeling like out of proportion with it, where you're not able to like live your day to day, that's a very important sign to go to your doctor and have that checked. I think a lot of times we're seeing a good amount of lower progesterone these days for people because of stress from our environment, just like how our country is run a lot, and like that hyper productivity, like we need to be successful and like go and show up every day. And I think like that burnout aspect of like being like a driven person in this country can be really detrimental to our follicular development and our progesterone production. And then partly to our diet as well, eating more processed foods and not having a good balance with good quality foods as well. That can lead to less progesterone. But sorry, I feel like I kind of went a little bit off on that. The other signs that to look out for like PCOS, that would be if you're having cycles that are longer than like the typical range, which would be like 26 to like 34 is like the ideal range. If it's longer than that, that means that your body is going a longer time without getting to an ovulation event. So, in basic anatomy, they're always teaching this that like ovulation's happening on cycle day 14. But in reality, there's a wide range. Like I have people that ovulate as early as like cycle day 9, some people that aren't ovulating until like way out in like the 20s. And so that's just because it takes a different amount of time for our follicle to build up. Just kind of each month it varies. Everyone has a different pattern, but every month you have a different follicle that's being developed too, so it will shift even for yourself. So your follicular phase is very variable. Your luteal phase is always going to be 12 to 16 days, give or take, because that's how long it takes for this corpus luteum to dissolve. If you notice that your luteal phase is shorter than the 12 days, then that would be a sign that you have low progesterone. Or if you're having a lot of spotting right before your period, that would be a sign that you have low progesterone as well. If you're not having a good cervical mucus buildup, that might be a sign that we're not getting to an ovulation event, or you don't have as much estrogen there. Trying to think what other ones would be a good sign with it to note, but yeah, so if the cycle is very variant, if your luteal phase is shorter than that 12 days, that would be an important one to note. If you're not getting that ovulation signs, that would be a good one to bring into your doctor. PMS symptoms, irregular spotting. Trying to think of anything else, but those are the main ones, I'd say.
I also have another question. Yeah, I think because for women, probably not for male, the age is pretty big factors. And when would you recommend us if we consider for the woman, like if we want to do egg freezing, like what age would we do that? Like is the most optimal timing for that? Or to
Right.
seek the advice.
Yeah. So I personally in my practice right now don't do egg freezing. I usually refer them over to the reproductive clinic for that. But from the research that I've read with it, they say by age 35 is like the ideal time before that to freeze eggs if you're wanting to, just because the studies have shown with it that egg quality just diminishes a little bit more after age 35, just with aging. Because typically most women, by the age of 40, that's where like stuff is starting to slow down a little bit more. Menopause can kind of shift a little bit around like 40 to like 50 is like the typical age range. That can depend on your genetics a lot. So usually if you look at what age your like mom or your aunts or like other women in your family have gone through menopause, you can kind of like give or take like a few years of that is when you yourself will. So it really is congruent with a lot of like genetics with that. So you could look at that too to see. But that'd be something if you are thinking about it, I'd say like maybe around like age 35 would be like the time to like be making sure to have that discussion with your doctor. They can draw your like your AMH level, look at your hormones in that aspect too. I will say with the egg freezing, then with that after how to get pregnant with the egg freezing is through the IVF method. So they'd have to like I think they could do like where they implant the egg and then, but yeah, most of the time I think they're doing the IVF after that too. So just keeping that in mind that it's like a few different steps with it there. So I'm like wasn't sure if like everybody is like aware of that when they hear the term egg freezing. They go through like the whole process of like retrieving the eggs and then you have them frozen and then later when you're ready to use them they can implant the sperm there and then they can re-implant that embryo to you. So and you'd still need to be having your cycles too for them to use that egg at that time. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hopefully that helped to answer it.
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Oh, I guess that kind of reminds me, for basal body temperature, I didn't bring up, there's a few different ones now that are coming out of different ways to track your temperature as well, instead of like taking your temperature every morning. There's an armband called Temp Drop that you can wear every night. And it records it so then you don't have to worry about like waking up and like taking your temperature. And it syncs directly to I think there's a few different apps that it syncs to with the Temp Drop. I know Chartneo is one of them, Read Your Body is another one. I think it works with Natural Cycles as well. Natural Cycles, I think also does like with the Aura Ring. Natural Cycles isn't my favorite one because it doesn't let you do like the cervical mucus and all the other stuff, but a lot of people like that one because it works with the Bluetooth with those the Temp Drop or the Aura Ring. But yeah, I was like, that's an option too if you're wanting to help confirm ovulation every month with it. Or you can always ask your healthcare provider for like a standing order for progesterone. So you can just go to the lab 7 days after your peak day, whether that's with like your LH positive or your cervical mucus, and check your progesterone level at that time. If your progesterone's over, usually we want to see it like above a 12, and that confirms that you had a good ovulation. If it's post peak day 7 and above a 12. I can go back to the slide with the labs too, because I put the numbers over on the side too for some of them here. So you guys can see like what the ideal ranges for some of those labs would be.
I have a question. I
Yeah.
was wondering what's your perspective about using supplements. There's lots of vitamins and said that maybe you can improve your fertility. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, good question. There's so many different like supplements and kind of messages of different ones. Usually, anyone who's coming into my clinic, I always recommend omega-3, a prenatal vitamin, and vitamin D. And then also CoQ10 can be useful as well for egg quality and sperm quality. CoQ10 you might want to only use for like 6 months or a year, and then give your body a break with it because you can kind of just build up resistance to it. So those are the ones that I'd always recommend to start out with, the omega-3, vitamin D, and prenatal, and then possibly the CoQ10. And then kind of depending on what other like hormonal aspects you have going on, that can clue me into like what other supplements to recommend. Very common ones is like Vitex or Chaseberry. I recommend for anyone that has like a low progesterone production or estrogen dominance, or if they have elevated prolactin, that one can help with all of that. If you have insulin resistance, myo-inositol and berberine are 2 good supplements to add in. What other ones would I usually say? If you have elevated androgens, spearmint and zinc are really good. So like that would be like a lot of like the PCOS symptoms with the acne or like hair growth. Those ones are beneficial in that aspect. Or if you like check your labs and you have elevated testosterone or DHEA, that would be good. I do have a lot of people that have like lower estrogen and a low DHEA. And then in that case, we just supplement with DHEA itself. For your thyroid, selenium is really good. Or black seed oil is another one. Yeah, there's so many. I'm like thinking about all of them, and I've done a little bit of extra research into herbal medicine as well too, just to better understand that, because I feel like we should be able to help ourselves out the best we can, like at home and through plant aspect as well. And it's kind of cool how like herbal medicine and diet really do link together. I find a lot of like benefit in just like having tea. Sometimes with like peppermint tea and ginger tea are really good for like morning sickness, and like spearmint tea helps with acne and stuff. So yeah, I just like to play around with some of those. Red clover is a good one in a tea for like estrogen, and red raspberry leaf tea for uterine toning. So like if you have a lot of cramping, you can use red raspberry leaf tea.
As someone in their mid-20s, how can I best take care of my body now if I want to have kids later on in life?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I kind of say this to any patient that's coming in. I'm like, the best way to have a healthy pregnancy is to be healthy yourself, and taking care of your body. So being in the best health you can be. Our cycles are the first thing to kind of clue us into any imbalances that we have health-wise. Because if your body's under stress, or there's like a process that isn't working with like digestion, or like if you have like high blood pressure, like something that's a little bit off, the first thing that's going to reflect that is your ovulation or like your sperm production. Because if your body's out of balance, the first thing it's going to turn off is fertility, because it's going to be like, hey, I'm not ready to um, procreate at this time because I have other things that are more important that I'm trying to fix and repair. So just kind of like if you were really stressed out, if there was like a famine, or like back, if you think about it, if there was like a pandemic, or like a in the past, or there's like a a big threat to your safety, the first thing that's going to turn off is your reproductive capacity. That's where like if people were like starving, they wouldn't have a period, or like if they were in like a war, there might not be as many cycles for the women that are in that environment. So our body is a good clue, gives us a good clue in that if there's any health things going on, the first thing that's going to show that or reflect that is our cycle. So making sure you're having overall good health, exercise, sleep, maintaining your stress, eating the best you can, and then start tracking your cycle and kind of understanding where that's at, and if you're having ovulation events. Yeah, charting down, even if it's like, I don't really need to go to the doctor, like start supplements and stuff, just starting to track like, oh, I've noticed I had more acne this month, or my period was more painful this month. And keeping a record of that so that when you do go to get your like physical exam done, you can bring that up to your doctor and see what they want to check overall health wise for. Yeah, because I have a lot of patients too where they're coming to me not just for fertility, but they're like, hey, I have all this stuff out of whack with my cycle. And I'm like, okay, well, it's because we've got some insulin resistance or pre-diabetes, or like we have high blood pressure or like high cholesterol and other stuff that we need to manage. So it's not just about fertility, but also your just overall health. So that was a long answer for that, but yeah, I'll put up my contact info again here too. So you can feel free to email me. I'm working on building my website a little bit more too. But I want to have like an offering of like, if you want to like review anything with your cycle charting or anything, that you can sign up on my website and do like a Zoom call with me for a half hour, an hour to review stuff or ask questions. If you have a healthcare provider that can order you labs and stuff, if you're not local. If you're local, you could see me at the University of Utah too, if you need a healthcare provider that specializes in this. So
If there's no any other question, then we will. Thanks so much for Janelle's details presentation. It's really helpful. And I think a lot of people just really want to have this topic, so they probably will watch the recordings later. So yeah, and probably contact you to work with you one-on-one. Yes, but thanks so much. Yes, thanks so much.
my pleasure.
Yes,
Thanks, guys. Thanks for everyone for
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Hope you
Bye.
guys all have a good rest of your weekend and happy holidays.
Thank you and happy holidays.